It was a typical Saturday afternoon, and the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the neighborhood. In the heart of the city there was a family, an ordinary one, just like any other. The Johnsons lived in a modest house on a quiet street, their lives defined by the simple rhythms of daily routines. Charles Johnson, a hard-working man in his early 40s, had spent the day helping a neighbor fix a fence, while his wife, Carla, kept their home in perfect order. Their two children, 14-year-old Jordan and 10-year-old Amir, had been out playing basketball at the local park. It was an unremarkable day in every way, save for the sense of peace that came with family time. Jordan, the older of the two, had always been the more athletic one, playing sports year-round. But today, it was Amir, usually more reserved, who was filled with energy. The two brothers had just finished a quick game of one-on-one basketball. Sweat glistened on their faces, but they were laughing. The sound of their joy carried on the wind. Amir dribbled the ball in a playful manner as Jordan stood a few feet away, shaking his head at his little brother's antics. "Come on, man, you're getting good." Jordan laughed, wiping his brow. "You might actually beat me one day." Amir grinned, confident in his own way. "Not today," he said with a chuckle. As the ball flew from Amir's hands, a sudden gasp came from Jordan's direction. The ball hit the pavement with a dull thud, and Amir collapsed onto the court, clutching his chest. His breathing became shallow, his face pale. Jordan rushed to his side, panic rising in his chest. Amir, what's going on?" he cried out. The world around them seemed to slow, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. Amir gasped for air, his hands clutching at his chest, as if trying to hold onto the air itself. Jordan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his brother's arm and helped him to his feet, shouting for help. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, unsure of what was happening, but quickly realizing the seriousness of the situation. A few moments later, Carla, Amir's mother, arrived at the scene, her face going pale at the sight of her son struggling to breathe. The ambulance arrived in what felt like an eternity, but the sound of the siren and the paramedics rushing to Amir's side brought a sense of urgency to the scene. They loaded Amir into the back of the ambulance and rushed him to the nearby emergency room, where they hoped a doctor could figure out what was wrong. The parents were frantic, talking to each other in hushed tones, trying to hold themselves together as they followed the ambulance in their car. Carla was on the phone with the hospital, trying to get more information about Amir's condition. Jordan sat beside her, staring out of the window, the weight of the situation pressing down on his chest. At the hospital, they were quickly escorted to the emergency room, the lights overhead buzzing as they passed through the sterile hallways. The smell of antiseptic was overwhelming, but it was the least of their worries. Carla's heart pounded in her chest as they were guided into a small room, where Amir was already lying on an examination table. A doctor entered the room, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a white coat, his face seemingly indifferent as he glanced at the medical chart. "Okay, what's the problem here?" the doctor asked, not making eye contact with them at first. Carla's frustration grew as she looked at Amir, still clutching his chest, struggling to breathe. "My son can't breathe. He needs help," she said urgently, her voice trembling. The doctor finally looked up, seemingly annoyed. He didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation, as his eyes flicked between the chart and Amir's labored breathing. The doctor let out a sigh and casually moved to check Amir's vitals. "It's probably just a panic attack or something. Nothing to worry about," he said dismissively, brushing off the family's concerns. Carla's face flushed with anger as she stepped closer. "Panic attack? Are you serious? My son is in pain. He's having trouble breathing. We need answers," she snapped. The doctor, unfazed, turned back to Amir and gave him a quick, half-hearted examination. "I'm sure it's nothing. Just give him some water and let him rest," he replied curtly, as though the situation was beneath him. Carla stood frozen, her heart racing. The severity of Amir's condition was beyond her understanding, but she knew one thing for sure. This doctor wasn't treating it with the urgency it required. Before Carla could protest further, the doctor turned his back to them. "I don't have time for this," he muttered under his breath. "You can leave if you're not satisfied." The words hit Carla like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to speak, but the doctor was already heading for the door. Jordan's eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait. What?" he asked, voice trembling. "You're just going to send him out like this?" The doctor paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder with a cold expression. "You heard me," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "If you don't want to listen to medical advice, you can leave." Carla's eyes filled with tears, her frustration boiling over into anger. Amir's breathing was still shallow, and here they were being kicked out of an emergency room like they were inconveniencing him. "This is outrageous," Carla cried, holding Amir tightly as the doctor walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. The seconds felt like hours as Carla struggled to hold her composure. She looked at Amir, who was still wheezing, his face pale and tired. Jordan, shaking with disbelief, reached for his phone. "We need to get him to another hospital. Now," he said urgently, trying to keep his voice steady. Carla nodded, though her mind was racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. They were supposed to be getting help, not being dismissed and humiliated. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't let Amir suffer any longer. She hugged her son tightly and whispered, "We're going to get you the help you need, Amir. I promise." As they left the ER, Carla's mind swirled with questions about the doctor's behavior, about the unfairness of it all. Why was he so quick to dismiss her son? Why was it that in a moment of crisis, when they needed compassion and expertise, they were met with indifference? Her heart ached for Amir, but something inside her was stirring. This wasn't just about her son's health anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a chain of events that would set off a series of life-changing decisions. Amir's story was about to take a turn no one saw coming, one that would challenge the moral compass of everyone involved. What they would learn in the days to come would change the course of their lives forever. As Carla and Jordan rushed Amir to the next closest hospital, the world outside their car seemed to blur, just a streak of gray and movement. They barely noticed the passing cityscape as Carla's mind raced, her thoughts fragmented by a cascade of emotions. Anger, confusion, fear for her son's health. Amir, sitting slumped between them, was still struggling to breathe, his chest rising and falling in labored gasps. His pale face and the occasional wince of pain cut through Carla's heart, and yet the injustice they had just faced was gnawing at her. The drive to the next hospital felt endless, as though the seconds stretched into hours. Carla tried to comfort Amir, but her words seemed hollow, useless. Jordan, who normally would have been offering some lighthearted joke to ease the tension, remained silent, his face clouded with disbelief. His young mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. How could a doctor, someone who had sworn to help people, treat a sick child with such disdain? It was beyond him, beyond anyone in their small circle of friends and family. As they pulled into the parking lot of the next hospital, Carla could feel a slight tremor in her hands. This wasn't just a simple visit to the ER anymore. This was a moment where everything changed, where the system they had always trusted failed them, and they were left to navigate it alone. She could feel the heat of righteous anger rising in her chest, but there was no time for that now. Amir needed help, not their fury. They were rushed into the ER of this new hospital by a nurse who immediately noticed Amir's condition. The nurse wasted no time, calling for a team to meet them at the door. Amir was wheeled away to an exam room, and for a few brief moments, Carla and Jordan were left standing in the sterile hallway, the sterile smell of antiseptic overwhelming. Carla clenched her fists, her eyes fighting back tears. The anger she had felt earlier swelled again. Why had they been dismissed so easily? Why was Amir not treated with the urgency he deserved? Jordan, who had been pacing in frustration, stopped in his tracks when a doctor appeared. She was young, maybe in her 30s, but her calm demeanor immediately reassured them. "I'm Dr. Harper," she introduced herself. "I understand we're dealing with some severe respiratory distress. We'll take good care of him, but I need to ask a few questions. Is that all right?" Carla, still shaken, nodded, finding comfort in the doctor's clear confidence. As the doctor began her examination of Amir, she explained what was happening to his lungs, providing a quick but thorough analysis. The news was difficult to process. Amir had a rare condition, one that could cause inflammation in the lungs, making it difficult to breathe. It wasn't life-threatening if treated properly, but without medical intervention, things could escalate quickly. Carla felt a sense of relief. Finally, someone who understood, someone who wasn't brushing her off. But that relief was fleeting. As the doctor prepared to administer a treatment, Carla's mind wandered back to the earlier incident, the cruelty of the first doctor's actions. She couldn't shake the feeling that Amir had been dismissed simply because of who they were, a black family coming into a hospital in distress. It seemed so much more than a simple medical mistake. It felt personal. How many other families, how many other people of color, had been treated the same way? How many had suffered silently, too afraid to speak up? Jordan broke her thoughts, his voice tense. "Mom, we need to do something. We can't just let this go." That doctor, he didn't care. He didn't even look at Amir like he was a real person. Carla's heart broke at the sincerity in his voice, the frustration of a young boy who just couldn't understand why they had been treated with such disdain. He was right. This wasn't just about Amir anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of systemic negligence they had just witnessed, about holding the people responsible accountable for their actions. But how? What could they do? For the first time, Carla truly felt powerless. She had always prided herself on being a strong, capable woman, able to handle whatever life threw at her. But in this moment, she felt small. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't part of some powerful organization that could stand up to the system. But one thing she was sure of was that her son was not a piece of paperwork, not an inconvenience. He was a human being, and he deserved to be treated with dignity. The thought of the doctor who had kicked them out of the ER made her blood boil. She could picture him clearly now, his dismissive expression, his tone full of arrogance, as if he had the right to disregard her child's pain. Carla had always been a mother who trusted in the medical system, in the idea that doctors were there to help, to heal. But now, that trust had been shattered. How many times had this happened before? How many other families had walked out of that ER in tears, humiliated and unheard? While Amir was being treated, Carla and Jordan sat in a waiting room, their thoughts heavy with the enormity of what had just transpired. A few minutes passed, then a few hours. The tension between them was palpable, an unsaid agreement between mother and son that something needed to be done. Carla leaned forward in her seat, her hands clasped tightly together. "We need to do something," she said quietly, but firmly. "We need to make sure no one else has to go through what we went through today." Jordan nodded, his eyes burning with determination. "We can't let that doctor get away with it. He needs to pay for what he did." It wasn't just about revenge for them anymore. It was about righting a wrong, about ensuring that this kind of mistreatment didn't happen to anyone else. And although Carla wasn't sure how they would do it, she felt a shift inside her. Something was beginning to take shape, a plan born from pain and injustice. When Amir was finally stable enough to be discharged, Carla felt a strange sense of relief. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but he was better, and that was enough for now. As they prepared to leave, the weight of the situation began to settle in her chest. They had been wronged, and they couldn't just walk away from it. The road ahead was uncertain, but Carla was certain of one thing. They were going to fight. The fight wasn't just about her son's health anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about speaking out, even when it felt impossible. And though she didn't know how it would end, Carla knew that one thing was clear. This would not be the last time the world heard their story. The days that followed Amir's treatment were a blur of appointments, medications, and subtle shifts in the Johnson family dynamic. Amir, though still recovering, had returned to his normal self. He was back in school, albeit with a slight limp from lingering chest pain, but his spirit had remained unbroken. His eyes sparkled with the same mischievous gleam they always had, but there was an underlying layer of anger and frustration he couldn't shake. Carla, too, felt a gnawing sense of injustice, the fire from the ER incident still burning inside her. Jordan, though trying to return to his own routine, couldn't help but talk about the doctor, about the way they had been dismissed and humiliated, and how he couldn't stand the idea of letting it go. Carla tried to focus on the positives, on Amir's improvement, on their family being together again. But it was clear to her that something bigger was stirring in her son. Jordan wasn't the type to back down. He had always been the one to stand up for the underdog, to challenge unfairness. And as the days passed, he found himself becoming more and more determined to hold the doctor accountable. It started with small steps. Jordan began to ask questions, lots of them. He reached out to friends who had connections at the hospital, hoping to get more information about the doctor who had treated them. He started researching medical boards, filing complaints, and reading up on the rights of patients. His search for answers became almost obsessive, and the more he dug, the more he uncovered. It wasn't just the one incident in the ER. The doctor, whose name was Dr. Grant Mitchell, had a pattern of dismissing patients who didn't fit a certain mold, mostly people of color, the poor, and those without significant insurance. The deeper Jordan looked, the more troubling it became. What was even more unnerving to him was the discovery of Mitchell's past, his history of complaints filed against him, some of them dating back years. There were whispers of incidents where the doctor had behaved inappropriately toward other patients, particularly minorities. But each time, those complaints were quietly swept under the rug, dismissed with some bureaucratic excuse or another. It became clear to Jordan that this wasn't an isolated case. Dr. Mitchell wasn't just a doctor who made a mistake. He was a man who had been given power over lives and had used it with indifference, if not outright cruelty. Jordan's frustration began to grow, but so did his sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let this go. It wasn't enough for him to know the truth. He needed to expose it. He needed to make sure that no one else would have to endure the same mistreatment that his family had. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and he knew the consequences might be significant. But there was a fire inside him now, a fire that wouldn't let him rest until justice was served. The more Jordan researched, the more he realized how little he knew about the system he was up against. He wasn't a lawyer, a journalist, or an activist. He was just a kid who had been wronged and wanted to make things right. But as he sat at the kitchen table one night, surrounded by printouts and notes, a thought struck him. What if he could leverage the power of the community? The strength of collective action could go much further than one person's voice, and he knew he wasn't alone. Amir had suffered, but so had many others. Their story, his family's story, was one that could spark something much bigger than just a personal vendetta. Jordan's plan began to take shape. It wasn't about retaliation. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about accountability. And if it took exposing Dr. Mitchell to the public, to the medical community, and even to the law, then that's what he was going to do. But Jordan knew he had to be smart about it. He couldn't just go to the authorities and expect them to take his word for it. He needed evidence, hard evidence that couldn't be dismissed. So he began to gather it. The first step was reaching out to other patients who had been treated by Dr. Mitchell. He knew it wouldn't be easy. People who had been mistreated often kept quiet, afraid of being dismissed or retaliated against. But he also knew that silence allowed the system to perpetuate its injustices. Jordan started small, contacting a few people online, asking them to come forward and share their experiences. He was met with skepticism at first, but then something surprising happened. A few former patients reached out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and neglect. It turned out that Dr. Mitchell's indifference was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. With this new information, Jordan began to feel a sense of validation. He wasn't alone in this fight. The more people he spoke to, the more it became clear that Dr. Mitchell had been running unchecked for years, his harmful practices covered up by hospital administrators more concerned with protecting their reputation than serving their patients. It sickened him, but it also motivated him. Jordan knew the next step was crucial. He needed to get in touch with someone who could help him turn these scattered accounts into something concrete, someone who could help him navigate the legal system, someone who could offer a platform for the voices that had been silenced for so long. He turned to an old friend of Carla's, a local lawyer named Samira Green. Samira had helped Carla in the past with minor legal matters, but Jordan wasn't sure if she could help with something this big. Still, he took a leap of faith and reached out to her, explaining the situation. When Jordan met with Samira, he could see that she was skeptical at first. After all, she was a professional, and he was just a teenager with an idea. But as he laid out the evidence, interviews, witness statements, medical records, Samira's expression slowly changed. She became serious, her eyes narrowing as she read through the files Jordan had collected. "You've done your homework," Samira said quietly. "This is serious. And if what you're saying is true, Dr. Mitchell needs to be held accountable." With Samira's help, Jordan began to form a strategy to bring Dr. Mitchell's actions to light. They would start by filing formal complaints with the medical board, gathering as much evidence as possible to back up their claims. But they wouldn't stop there. They would make sure the media got involved, so that the story would spread beyond their small community. If they were going to fight this system, they would do it with everything they had. Meanwhile, the Johnsons' lives were changing in ways they didn't yet understand. Amir, despite his improving health, was carrying the weight of the situation with him, in ways that no one could fully grasp. Every time he went to school, he could feel the weight of being the victim in the story. His friends would ask questions, and though he tried to laugh it off, he couldn't deny the sense of injustice that lingered. His life had changed forever, but so had his view of the world. For a young boy, he had learned early on how deep-rooted the systems of power could be, and how important it was to stand up to them. But with each day that passed, they were closer to their goal. Jordan was more determined than ever to see this through, to expose the man who had caused so much harm and to make sure that no one else ever had to suffer the way Amir did. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for truth, and it was a fight they were prepared to win. The following weeks were a whirlwind of action, uncertainty, and mounting tension, as Jordan and Samira Green worked tirelessly behind the scenes to gather more evidence. The Johnsons found themselves at the center of a storm. They hadn't anticipated the reach their case would have, nor did they fully comprehend the ripple effects that their decision to stand up would cause. It started with phone calls, requests for interviews, statements from reporters, and inquiries from advocacy groups that had caught wind of the story. The pressure weighed heavily on Carla. At first, she had been resolute in her desire to hold Dr. Mitchell accountable. But as the story spread through the community, and eventually to local media outlets, she found herself caught in a constant balancing act. She wanted to make sure that Amir's health was still the family's top priority, but the fight for justice had become something much bigger. It was as if the entire neighborhood had taken on their cause, rallying behind them, with many offering support and others questioning why they hadn't spoken out sooner. As the first complaint against Dr. Mitchell was filed with the state medical board, Carla felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, something could be done. But there was also a sense of unease that settled deep in her chest. What if they failed? What if Dr. Mitchell had too much power, too many connections, for them to make a dent? What if in the end they were just a family taking on a system that was too big to change? But that thought was fleeting. They had come this far. There was no turning back. Meanwhile, Dr. Mitchell was completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. He went about his daily routine, attending to patients with the same indifferent manner he had always shown. But behind the scenes, things were starting to unravel. The first complaint had triggered an internal investigation at the hospital where he worked. His colleagues, many of whom had long turned a blind eye to his behavior, began to question their own role in what had been happening under their noses. It wasn't just one incident, it was a history of mistakes, a string of small injustices that no one had bothered to address. Dr. Mitchell's arrogance, once his shield, was now his downfall. As the days passed, it became clear that the public pressure was mounting. News outlets began to pick up on the case. Carla, though she had never imagined herself as an advocate or public figure, found herself doing interviews and speaking at community meetings. Her voice, once quiet and reserved, had become a powerful tool in the fight for justice. She wasn't just speaking for her son anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated. She had become a symbol of resistance against a system that had too often left marginalized communities behind. But with the newfound visibility came an unexpected twist. As more people came forward with their own stories of mistreatment by Dr. Mitchell, the pressure on the doctor grew unbearable. He began to feel the walls closing in on him. His once confident and brash demeanor turned to a quiet, seething anger. How could this have happened? How had his reputation, so carefully constructed over the years, been torn down so quickly? He started to realize that his career might be over. He couldn't fathom how everything he had worked for could unravel so completely in such a short time. One evening, as Jordan and Carla sat together in their living room, they received a phone call that would change the course of their fight. It was from a former patient of Dr. Mitchell's, someone who had been hesitant at first, but now, emboldened by the growing support around the case, had come forward with a damning story. This individual, a woman named Alicia, had been treated by Dr. Mitchell several years ago when she was pregnant with her child. Her experience mirrored the same pattern of indifference and negligence that had plagued the Johnson family's encounter. She described how Dr. Mitchell had dismissed her symptoms, causing her to nearly lose her baby. The details were shocking, and the timeline matched up perfectly with the events they had already uncovered. This new testimony became the key piece of evidence they had been hoping for. Alicia's story, combined with the growing number of patients who were willing to share their experiences, gave them the ammunition they needed to push forward. Jordan and Samira worked quickly, drafting legal documents and preparing to file a formal lawsuit against Dr. Mitchell. They also reached out to several local news outlets, including the station that had initially covered Amir's story, to make sure the public knew the full extent of what had happened. As the legal battle took shape, the Johnsons found themselves caught in the web of public opinion. While many in their community rallied behind them, others questioned their motives. Some people believed that they were overreacting, that they had been too quick to judge the doctor. Others, particularly those who had never faced the kind of discrimination that the Johnsons had, found it hard to understand how one doctor's behavior could have such a profound impact. Carla, frustrated by the divisive opinions, did her best to stay focused on the mission. She wasn't doing this for the praise or the recognition. She was doing it for Amir, for the people who couldn't speak up, for the ones who had been hurt and silenced for far too long. But the tension was palpable. There were moments of doubt, moments when Carla wondered if they were doing the right thing. What if they were bringing unnecessary attention to a man who, despite his flaws, had helped countless patients over the years? What if the backlash from the medical community was too much to handle? She had never considered herself a fighter, and now, here she was, on the front lines of a battle she never asked for. The moment of reckoning came when Dr. Mitchell, in an attempt to salvage what was left of his reputation, reached out to the Johnson family. He requested a meeting, a chance to explain himself, to apologize for his actions. The message, delivered through his attorney, was framed as an olive branch. But Carla, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, was less than interested in hearing excuses. "I'll tell you what," Carla said, her voice steady, but laced with an unmistakable edge. "If you really want to make things right, you can do it in public. You can admit what you did, You can apologize to every single person you've wronged, and you can show the world that you're willing to change. Otherwise, there's nothing left to say. Jordan, standing beside her, felt a swell of pride. It was the first time he had seen his mother take such a strong stand, refusing to settle for anything less than true accountability. They weren't looking for an apology just for them. They were fighting for every person who had been subjected to the same kind of callousness. Dr. Mitchell could no longer hide behind his status or his charm. He would either face the consequences of his actions or fade into irrelevance. Dr. Mitchell, cornered and desperate, began to realize that this wasn't a fight he could win with charm or influence. The truth had a way of slipping through the cracks, and it had caught up with him. The system he had relied on to protect him was now working against him, and the people who had been victims of his neglect were now his accusers. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. News outlets picked up on the story, painting a picture of a man who had abused his position of power for far too long. The medical board launched a formal investigation, and Dr. Mitchell was suspended from practicing medicine pending the outcome. His career, once filled with promises and accolades, came crashing down in a matter of weeks. For the Johnson family, the victory was bittersweet. The battle had taken a toll on them. Amir was still recovering physically, but the emotional scars of what they had been through would take longer to heal. They had fought for justice, and they had won, but it was clear to Carla and Jordan that the fight for systemic change was far from over. What had begun as a personal journey for accountability had transformed into something much larger, a movement that would inspire others to speak out, to demand better, and to challenge the institutions that had long failed them. The fight had changed them all. And in the end, they knew one thing for certain. The truth would always come to light, no matter how hard anyone tried to bury it. The aftermath of the lawsuit was nothing short of transformative for the Johnson family. Though the storm of media attention had calmed somewhat, the emotional and social consequences of their fight were only just beginning to settle. Amir had healed physically, but his perception of the world had shifted drastically. He found himself more aware of the systemic injustices that people in his community, and especially his family, faced. What had once been a quiet, almost naive belief in the fairness of the world had now been replaced with an acute awareness of how deep-rooted inequality ran. For Carla, the victory felt both empowering and isolating. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing they had brought about change. Dr. Mitchell had been suspended indefinitely, and the medical board was reviewing numerous other complaints against him, many of which had been buried for years. But this victory was bittersweet. Carla had wanted justice for Amir, but now she also had to reconcile with the wider implications of their actions. Their fight had put a spotlight on them that they weren't fully prepared for. People from all walks of life began reaching out to share their own stories of mistreatment and injustice at the hands of doctors, hospitals, and even the system itself. Carla found herself in the center of a narrative she hadn't expected, one that wasn't just about her family's pain, but about a much larger and more pervasive issue. While the family had garnered support, they'd also faced backlash. Some believed they had gone too far, even though the evidence was clear. Carla and Jordan knew they had made the right decision, but they couldn't ignore the divisive comments from some in their community. There were those who insisted that Dr. Mitchell was a good doctor who had simply made a mistake, and others who believed the media had exaggerated the story for dramatic effect. People who had never experienced the kind of marginalization the Johnsons had faced could never fully understand what they had gone through. Carla sometimes felt exhausted by the questions, the well-meaning but misguided suggestions, and the endless discussions about the doctor's reputation. It was as though the world couldn't comprehend that this wasn't just about one man. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long. Jordan, on the other hand, had found purpose in a way he hadn't expected. He was no longer the confused teenager who had stumbled upon a broken system. Now he was an advocate. With the help of Samira Green, he became involved in local grassroots movements aimed at addressing issues of healthcare inequality. The injustice Amir had faced had opened Jordan's eyes to a world of systemic issues he hadn't been aware of before. He wasn't content to stop with this one victory. If anything, the success of the law, it was as if the floodgates had opened, and now the injustices, long buried, were being exposed. The community, once divided, began to shift as well. There was a growing sense of solidarity as people recognized the necessity of speaking out, of holding those in power accountable for their actions. Even those who had initially criticized the Johnsons began to see the value of their fight. People started to ask themselves difficult questions about race, privilege, and healthcare, and they began to challenge the status quo in ways they hadn't before. Carla had become an unwitting leader in this movement, not through any ambition or desire for fame, but through her quiet strength and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The changes didn't come quickly, nor were they without opposition, but the fact that they were happening was undeniable. There was a palpable shift in the air, a feeling that the Johnsons had sparked something much larger than themselves. The battle had not been easy, but in the end, it had been worth it. Amir had become a symbol, not just of victimhood, but of resilience, of the power of speaking out, and the importance of justice. As a family, they had learned that sometimes the price of truth was high, but the reward was worth every sacrifice. As Carla sat in the kitchen late one evening, sipping her coffee, she glanced at her son, who was deep in thought, his face serious as he scribbled notes on a notepad. The weight of everything that had happened over the past several months hung in the air, but she could also feel the sense of pride that came from knowing they had fought for what was right. Their journey wasn't over, but they had laid the foundation for change. The world was watching, and they had started something that could not be undone. It was just the beginning of a much larger movement, a movement for justice, for fairness, and for equality that would ripple through their community and beyond. And as Amir looked up from his notepad, his eyes met his mother's, and for the first time in a long while, there was a smile on his face. He had found his purpose, and in that moment, Carla realized something she hadn't fully understood until now. This fight, their fight, was no longer just about a doctor or an incident. It was about creating a future where people like Amir didn't have to fight at all. And that future, though still a long way off, was now within reach. Months passed, and the Johnson family found themselves in an unexpected position, at the forefront of a movement they never intended to lead. What had started as a simple personal fight for justice had blossomed into something much larger. Carla and Jordan had become reluctant activists, using their platform to speak out on issues of race, inequality, and the failures of a system that had so often turned its back on the people who needed it most. They had given interviews, attended rallies, and spoken with countless people who had shared their own stories of being mistreated by the medical community. But no matter how many people they spoke to, how many new faces they encountered, Carla couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of exhaustion that came with being in the public eye. It wasn't just the media presence that wore her down. It was the emotional toll of reliving the pain over and over again. Each interview felt like she was reopening a wound, each headline forcing her to confront the injustice her family had endured. But there was also a growing sense of purpose in her. She could no longer remain silent. The fight was bigger than Amir's case. It was about dismantling a system that didn't care for its most vulnerable. Jordan had become a passionate voice in the movement, his role expanding beyond what he had ever imagined. He was no longer just a teenager advocating for his brother. He was now a young leader in his community, someone who had become more articulate and more aware of the systemic issues that plagued so many people. He spent hours researching laws, medical practices, and social issues, poring over every piece of information he could get his hands on. His drive to make the world better for people like Amir had deepened, and it was clear to everyone around him that this fight had ignited something in him, a sense of justice that was unwavering. But despite their progress, the fight was far from over. The medical board's investigation into Dr. Mitchell's actions was still ongoing, and while the case had brought attention to his misconduct, it also opened the door for more complaints to surface. More and more people were coming forward, people who had been too afraid to speak up before. It was both a triumph and a tragedy. Triumph because it meant people were finally being heard, but tragedy because it revealed how long the system had been ignoring the pain of so many. One evening, after another exhausting day of meetings, Carla and Jordan sat in their living room, a quiet calm finally settling over the house. Amir had gone to bed early, still struggling with his own feelings of being caught in the middle of something much larger than he had ever wanted. Though he was proud of what they had achieved, there were days when the weight of it all felt too much. He was just a kid, after all, and this battle for justice had placed him at the center of a storm he didn't know how to navigate. Carla knew that Amir was still processing everything that had happened. Though he was healing physically, the emotional scars of being disregarded, ignored, and then thrust into the limelight would take much longer to fade. She placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, a gesture of silent solidarity between them. He turned to her, a small smile on his face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it?" he asked quietly. "I mean, look at everything we've done. But it still feels like there's so much more to do. Like, even if Dr. Mitchell is gone, there's still so much wrong with everything. The system's still broken." Carla met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the weight of the question. "It was worth it," she said firmly. "Because if we don't stand up, nothing changes. But I get it, baby. I get how hard this has been. And I can't pretend like the fight is over. I can't promise it's going to be easy. But you did something incredible. We did something incredible." Jordan nodded, but the doubt in his eyes didn't disappear. "I know, but I think I'm just starting to realize how big this is. It's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt, everyone who's been ignored or treated like they don't matter." Carla pulled him into a tight hug. "I know, sweetie. And that's what makes this fight so important. We've opened a door for a lot of people who didn't have the strength to speak up before. But we're going to keep pushing, because it's not just about one doctor. It's about all the people who need to know that their voices matter too." It wasn't long before the media came calling again, but this time it felt different. Instead of feeling like they were just telling their story to others, Carla and Jordan had become part of a much larger conversation. They were invited to speak at forums about healthcare reform, their story used as an example of how the system could fail those it was meant to protect. They traveled to neighboring cities, spoke with advocacy groups, and became part of a coalition pushing for better oversight in healthcare institutions, especially in communities where access to care had historically been limited. But even as their work expanded, the personal toll remained. Carla and Jordan spent countless hours working to keep the momentum going, while Amir found himself increasingly detached. There were days when he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had become one of the stories the world was telling, rather than a life he had a say in. He loved his family deeply, and he was proud of their accomplishments, but he couldn't help but feel like he had been thrust into something that was too much for him to bear. It was as though he had become a symbol of resistance, but the weight of that role wasn't something he had ever asked for. One night, as Carla sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street, she finally spoke the words that had been lingering in her mind for weeks. "Do you think Amir's okay?" she asked Jordan, her voice tentative. Jordan sighed deeply, his fingers running through his hair. "I don't know, Mom. He's been really quiet lately. I think he feels like this whole thing is it's not his fight anymore. He never asked for it. I mean, he's proud of what we've done, but I don't think he ever thought it would get this big." Carla's heart ached as she thought about her son. He had always been a sensitive child, quick to notice when something wasn't right, but the emotional weight of this fight had been overwhelming for him. It wasn't just the media attention, or the fact that he was at the center of something so controversial. It was the emotional labor of witnessing so many others' pain. Amir had always been the type of kid who wanted to help, but this battle had been so draining. Carla knew he wasn't just physically exhausted, he was emotionally spent too. That night, Carla made a decision. She would step back, just for a while, to give Amir space to breathe. The movement, The fight for justice would continue. There was no doubt about that. But for now, their family needed to heal in ways that weren't visible to the world. Carla spoke to Jordan the next morning, explaining her plan. "We've done so much already, and we will keep fighting. But right now, Amir needs his space. He's been through more than anyone should ever have to go through. It's time to give him a chance to be just a kid again." Jordan nodded, understanding the weight of her decision. "You're right. We can't let everything fall on him. He's our son, and we need to take care of him before we take on the world." And so, the family found a moment of peace amidst the chaos. Amir spent more time with friends, doing things he had missed out on while the world had been watching. Carla and Jordan focused on the next steps in their advocacy, knowing that their fight was far from over. But the real victory, the one that no headline could capture, was in the quiet moments, the ones where they could simply be a family again. In the end, the Johnsons had learned an invaluable lesson. Change was not something that happened overnight. It was a process, one that required resilience, persistence, and a willingness to fight not just for justice, but for the humanity of every person involved. They had opened the door, but the work was ongoing, and they would continue to push for a world where no one was dismissed or ignored, no matter who they were. The journey had transformed them all in ways they hadn't anticipated, but one thing remained certain: they would never stop fighting for what was right. And no matter how long it took, they knew the battle for justice would never truly end until everyone had a seat at the table.